What if one day you woke up and realized you'd been raised by the wrong family your whole life? Huck is a bobcat rescued and raised by a lone cougar, growing up with a strange, broken howl that doesn't sound like any animal in the canyon. Then one night, when wildfire turns the valley into a burning trap, that wrong voice becomes the only sound loud enough to cut through smoke and panic, leading every creature to safety, and forcing three wary worlds to rethink what family and belonging really mean. The last light of the day slid off the red rock cliffs in slow, soft strokes, turning the canyon below into a deep purple bowl. Wind moved lazily through the sage and brittle grass, carrying the dry smell of dust and juniper, and something else that always made Huck's whiskers twitch, a faint tangle of fur, breath, and lives he could hear but not see. Far below, in the shadowed basin, the first coyote of the evening lifted his nose and sent a clean, clear howl into the bruised sky. Huck felt it before he heard it, a thin vibration in the stone under his paws, like a string being plucked. Then came another voice, higher and brighter, and another after that, until the canyon filled with a loose choir of wild, rising notes. It was a sound that spoke of belonging, of knowing exactly who you were and who would answer you in the dark. Coyotes did not have to wonder whether their voices fit. They simply opened their mouths and let the night carry their names. Up on the ridge, Huck stood alone on a narrow ledge of sandstone, the wind teasing at his spotted coat. To anyone looking from a distance, he was a bobcat like any other. Compact, powerful shoulders, tufted ears, short tail flicking with restless energy. Up close, though, there was something off in the way he held himself, as if his body still hadn't finished deciding what kind of cat it wanted to be. He stood too tall for a bobcat, his chest broad, his stance careful and deliberate, like a much larger cat that had somehow been poured into a smaller frame. He listened as the coyotes finished one chorus and let the echoes fade. The canyon grew quiet for a heartbeat, waiting. Huck swallowed. His throat felt dry. His heart ticked faster, not with fear exactly, but with a familiar, uneasy ache. This was the part of the evening he dreaded and craved in equal measure. Down below, beside a crooked mesquite tree, Huck could make out the lean figure of Ridge, the big coyote whose voice always started the song. Ridge shook out his gray coat, tipped his head back again, and sent up another smooth, rolling note. One by one the others joined in, their voices weaving together like threads on a loom. Even from up here, Huck could feel how their sound fit together. No gap, no rough edge. He could have just stood there and listened, like he had done 100 times. That would have been safer, easier. Instead, something in his chest pushed forward, stubborn as a river carving its way through. Stone. Tonight, Huck thought, I'm going to get it right. Just once. He stepped closer to the edge of the ridge. The drop beneath him was long and clean, a sheer slide of rock down to the first ledges and scrub. He had stood on worse, jumped from higher. The height was not what made his paws sweat. It was the idea of opening his mouth and having the canyon hear what came out. Another round of coyote song rose into the darkening sky. When it quieted again, Huck pulled in a breath so deep it made his ribs ache. He let his gaze drift toward the horizon where the sun had already slipped away, leaving only a band of fading gold. Somewhere in that distance were towns and houses, people locking doors and checking life insurance policies, counting retirement savings and mortgages, and all the quiet things they thought would keep them safe. Out here, safety was different. Out here, it came on 4 legs and sharp claws and voices that could carry across the miles. He opened his mouth. What he meant to send out was a clean, rising call like Ridge's. What came instead was something else entirely. A low, rumbling growl at the bottom, the kind that lived in the chest of a mountain lion. climbing awkwardly into a strangled yowl, then stretching into a broken, quivering note that tried to be a howl and missed the mark by a wide canyon's width. The sound scraped against the stone and bounced back at him, wrong, 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 from every face of rock. Down below, the coyote stopped mid-breath. Ridge's head turned upward, eyes locking on the ridge. One of the younger coyotes shifted from paw to paw, unsure whether to laugh or to bristle. Another tilted her head, ears pricked, as if she couldn't quite figure out what sort of animal had made that noise. Huck felt heat rush under his fur, his ears flattened back without him thinking about it. The tail he always tried to keep steady and proud gave a small, traitorous twitch. The worst part wasn't their silence. It was the echo of his own voice, still hanging in the air around him, thin and embarrassed. He swallowed again, tasting dust and something bitter. He could have tried once more, forced another sound into the sky, but the moment had closed like a door slammed in his face. Down in the basin, Ridge finally gave a short, clipped howl of his own as if to reset the song. Then the others joined in. Their voices rose again, smooth and sure, flowing right around that one crooked note as if it had never happened. Up on the ridge, Huck lowered himself to his belly, pressing his chest against the cool stone. The song rolled past him, around him, without him. He watched the coyotes as they finished, shook themselves out, and began to drift into the shadows, pairs and trios peeling off toward their hunting grounds. No one called up to him. No one sent a strange, broken howl of their own in answer. It shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. He was not a coyote. He knew that. He knew it in his bones, in the shape of his paws, in the way he moved along the cliff face, the way his mother had taught him. But knowing and feeling were two different things. Knowing he was a bobcat raised by a cougar did nothing to soften the quiet that followed a failed howl. For a long moment he simply lay there, letting the wind comb through his fur. Up here, a cat could almost pretend that being alone was a choice. Plenty of folks in the human world chose that kind of life too, he had heard in the distant murmur of camper radios and late-night talk shows. Retired people taking cross-country trips in old trucks, leaving behind the noise of cities and home insurance and endless phone calls from banks. Men and women selling the houses they'd worked so hard to pay off, trading a fixed mortgage for a little trailer and a bigger sky. Maybe, Huck thought, being on your own wasn't always a bad thing. But then the quiet found its way into the spaces between his ribs, and the ache came back. Behind him, from deeper inside the rocks, came a sound Huck knew better than his own heartbeat. Not a howl, not a yowl. A low, rich rumble that was neither question nor command, but something in between. Maya's voice. One short call, just his name, the way only she said it. He turned his head. In the mouth of a narrow cleft in the stone, a large, tawny shape waited in the shadows. Her eyes caught what little light was left, two steady embers watching him without judgment. Maya never tried to howl. She had never cared whether his voice sounded like hers or anyone else's. But she had heard the broken call all the same, and the silence that followed. Huck rose slowly to his feet. His muscles had cooled while he lay there. They did not move with cougar smoothness, no matter how hard he tried. He took one last glance down into the valley. The coyotes were gone now, only a faint scent and memory left on the air. The canyon looked peaceful, almost gentle, as if it had not just witnessed his failure. He padded back from the edge and crossed the narrow shelf toward Maya. As he slipped into the cleft beside her, the world shrank to the soft sound of her breathing and the familiar brush of her shoulder against his. She turned, nuzzled the top of his head once, then led the way down the twisting passage toward their den. The stone walls closed around them, warm and solid, smelling of old sun and cougar fur. Behind them, the ridge and the open sky waited for another night, another try. The question of his voice, of why it never seemed to fit, settled back into its usual place in the back of his mind, like a stone he had learned to carry. He did not know yet that the very thing he hated in himself, the wrongness of his howl, would one day be the only sound that could cut through fire and smoke and fear. For now he followed the cougar he called Mother into the dark, his steps echoing softly, the last faint memory of the coyote's clean, sharp song fading behind him like the tail end of a distant radio station drifting out of range. Long before Huck ever tried to match his voice to the coyotes in the valley, he was nothing more than a damp scrap of fur buried under a river of sand and wind. That memory lived in him the way old scars live in skin, a sensation more than a picture, a feeling of being pressed down and swallowed by something too big to fight. If he could have remembered it clearly, it would have begun on a quiet spring afternoon when the canyon felt gentle and safe. The day had started warm and still. Down in a shallow hollow at the base of a scrubby cottonwood tree, a bobcat mother lay stretched on her side, panting lightly, her side still tender from the effort of nursing a fresh litter. 4 tiny kits were pressed against her belly, their eyes sealed, their legs too weak to do more than paddle in soft sleep. One of them, the smallest, had to work harder to find a place at the milk, nudging and squirming until he found a free spot. She nudged him closer with her chin, patient and tired, the way any mother might reach for the tiniest baby in a crowded house. The sky then had been a clear blue bowl, no sign of trouble, no hint of what was rolling across the far flats toward them. Humans talk about sudden storms later, shaking their heads over weather reports and home insurance policies, saying there was no warning at all. In truth, there are almost always warnings. It's just that life feels calm right up until it isn't. Up on the higher shelves of rock, a cougar moved along a narrow trail, tail flicking lazily. Maya was not thinking of storms. She was thinking, in the slow, dull way that comes after grief, of how empty her den had felt for months. Once that crevice had held a warm tangle of her own cubs, 3 of them, each with a different way of tumbling over her paws. Then the rocks had shifted in a late winter freeze, a crack and rumble in the night, and by the time she clawed her way in, there had been only dust and silence. The canyon had taken her family without a sound anyone else would have noticed. She had gone through the motions of survival afterward, crossing the ridges to hunt, drinking where the spring seeped out at the base of the cliffs, lying in the sun to warm her bones. But the world had flattened. Even a mountain lion can know a kind of loneliness that feels like it has weight. It sat between her ribs like a misplaced stone. People feel it too when the house gets quiet after the kids leave, when the phone doesn't ring as often, when the talk turns to retirement plans and what to do with long, empty afternoons. Maya had no pension, no life insurance, no numbers to run on paper. All she had was the echo of her own footsteps and a den that no longer smelled of milk. That afternoon, as the sun eased down the sky, she paused at the edge of an overlook and tasted the air. Dust. Dry, but that was nothing new. Another sniff brought something sharper, finer, like powdered rock being sifted through a sieve. Out on the flatlands beyond the canyon's mouth, a brown smear on the horizon thickened, lifting into the sky as if the earth itself were boiling up into the air. A wind picked up, sharp and hot, pushing against her whiskers. The first fingers of the sandstorm had found the canyon. Down below, in the cottonwood hollow, the bobcat mother stirred uneasily. Her ears twitched, then flattened. She smelled it too now, the hot grit of sand and the strange pressure in the air. Somewhere to her left, a pair of coyotes broke into a sudden run, their bodies low to the ground, heading toward the higher, safer paths. She rose, the kits complaining in squeaks and sighs as the warm wall of her body moved away. She did not have time to think in words. Instinct spoke louder. Get the babies to cover. Move. Now. She picked up one kit, then another, small bodies dangling from her jaws as she darted from the shallow hollow to a deeper crack in the rocks nearby. The wind strengthened with each heartbeat, carrying sand that stung her eyes and nose. By the time she came back for the last two, the world had turned a murky, moving brown. Her whiskers were full of grit. The air felt thick, hard to pull into her lungs. She grabbed the larger of the two remaining kits, the one whose fur already seemed to glow with strong color. The smallest lay half on his side, blinking blindly, trying to find the warmth that had moved away. She would come back for him, she thought without thinking, the way a person might promise themselves they'll make just one more trip to the car for the last grocery bag, one more run, just one more. The sand hit then in a solid wall. It poured over the lip of the hollow like water, filling every low place. In seconds, the cottonwood trunk vanished in the blur. The bobcat mother crouched, body flattened against the ground, kit in her mouth, and felt the storm shove against her. A branch snapped somewhere overhead. Rocks rattled. The air roared so loud it swallowed the sound of her own breathing. She ran. Behind her, the smallest kit gave a thin, muffled cry and was swallowed by the sliding sand. Up on the ledge, Maya pressed herself against the stone as the storm swept in full. Sand stung her eyes. She narrowed them to slits and turned her head away from the worst of it. Visibility shrank to an arm's length. The entire canyon seemed to move, to shift, as if it were being erased and redrawn in the space of a heartbeat. Through all of that noise, she heard something that did not belong, a sound so fragile it barely made it past the roaring wind, a weak, rasping mewl that broke off halfway, as if the breath behind it had given out. It was close, too close to ignore. She moved toward it without pause. Any hunter who lives long enough learns to read sound and scent even when the world turns sideways. The cry came again, thinner, more desperate, from somewhere at the base of the rock below her trail. Maya dug her claws into the sand-slick stone, feeling for purchase, working her way down until the ledge widened to a narrow shelf. There, half buried where the hollow had been, she saw it. A small, sodden bundle of fur pinned under a fresh drift. One tiny paw twitched free, then sank back as more sand slid over it. There was no mother in sight, no other kits, just this one little body being slowly ground into the earth. Maya did not think of what species it was, or whether it was wise to interfere. Something older than thought moved her. Once, not so long ago, she had tried to dig her own young out of a fall of rock with these same paws. She had scraped until her claws broke and her gums bled from biting stone. She knew the terrible feel of reaching too late. She would not feel that again if she could help it. She lunged forward, lowering her head into the sand. It filled her nose, her eyes, her throat. But she pushed deeper, hooking her claws around the limp little form and dragging it free. The kit was cold, its fur matted, its mouth hanging slack. For a heartbeat she feared she had been late after all. Then she felt it, the faintest flutter of movement under her tongue where his chest lay pressed to her lower jaw. She pulled him up and turned her body broadside to the storm, using her own weight as a shield. For a moment they both vanished in the swirling dust, just another lump of moving earth. Then Maya fought her way back up the rock to her trail, one careful step at a time, clutching the kit as gently as if he were made of smoke. Her den was not far, a narrow opening behind a slant of stone that the wind usually slid past. She squeezed inside, sand still rattling down her back, and laid the kit on the packed earth in the warmest corner. The storm outside roared like an angry ocean. In here it was dim and close and quiet enough to hear the tiny, irregular wheeze of the kit's breathing. He was barely bigger than her forepaw. His fur was spotted and striped, his tail short, his ears tipped with tufts. A bobcat, then, not her kind, not her responsibility. Yet as she leaned down and began to lick the sand from his nose and mouth, she felt the old, familiar ache in her chest, shift, and crack. Little by little, the kit's sides began to move more evenly. He coughed once, a thin, wet sound, and expelled a small clot of mud. Maya continued to work over him, rasping her tongue along his spine, warming him, coaxing life back into that limp body. It was not so different from the way humans sit at hospital bedsides, watching the slow rise and fall of a loved one's chest, whispering silent bargains and prayers while doctors talk about health insurance and outcomes in the hallway. All that mattered in that moment was one more breath, and then another. By the time the storm began to ease and the roar outside faded to a dull hiss, the kit was breathing steadily. His paws flexed in slow, dreamlike motions. When Maya nudged him gently with her nose, his mouth opened in a blind search for warmth and milk, something inside her that had gone quiet after the rock slide stirred. She curled her body around him, a great tawny crescent, and drew him closer to her chest, where her heart beat strong and sure. He did not smell like her lost cubs, but he was small and helpless and alive, and for now that was enough. She did not know that the storm had stripped him of more than warmth and air, that it had taken his first family, his first language, the scent of his birth mother. She only knew that when she closed her eyes and breathed in, the emptiness in her den felt a little less wide. Outside, the canyon began to settle under a layer of fresh sand. Tracks were erased. Old paths vanished. Somewhere, a bobcat mother stared into the wind and counted the kits at her side, realizing that one was missing and unable to fight her way back. Life went on, brutally simple. Inside the den, the foundling shifted closer to Maya's belly and let out a tiny sound, halfway between a sigh and a squeak. She lowered her head until her nose touched the soft spot between his ears. This one, if she had used words, this one stays. Years later, when Huck stood on the ridge and sent his wrong, crooked howl into the evening air, he would not remember the moment he almost disappeared under a sandstorm. But somewhere in that odd, unplaceable voice was the echo of a day when the canyon tried to claim him, and a lone cougar refused to let him go. Huck's earliest days in the den on the cliff blurred together like a long, warm dream. The sandstorm outside had passed, but its shadow lingered in the way Maya watched the mouth of the cave, as if the sky might come crashing in again at any moment. For the little bobcat, though, life shrank to a simple circle: warmth, milk, sleep, and the steady thump of the cougar's heart beneath his cheek. At first he moved clumsily, paws paddling against Maya's chest as he rooted for milk. She had not planned on nursing again. Her own body had already begun to close that chapter. Still, nature makes room when it has to. Her milk came in thin at the beginning, and she had to hunt more often, bringing back rabbits and quail to keep her strength up. She would lie on her side afterward, ribs rising and falling, while the tiny stranger pressed in close, his spotted flanks heaving with the effort of drawing his own small breaths. He did not know he was different. To Huck, the curve of her throat, the rumble in her chest when she breathed deeply, the gentle rasp of her tongue across his fur, these were not the signs of another species. They were simply mother, the way a human baby only knows the smell of a favorite sweater or the sound of a lullaby, not the price of the mortgage or the details of the retirement plan carrying the household. Out here, there were no bills taped to the fridge, no talk of health insurance or Medicare. There was only the daily business of staying alive. As the days turned into weeks, his legs grew stronger. First he crawled, then he tottered, then he wobbled into something that almost looked like a walk. Maya watched with a patience born partly from love, partly from the deep understanding that nothing grows the way you expect it to. Her own lost cubs had been heavier in the shoulders, slower to move, their paws larger, their balance different. Huck's body seemed built on a lighter frame, all quick angles and narrow bones. When he tried to jump up onto a low rock the way she did, his back legs pushed too soon or too late, and he'd smack his chin, blink in surprise, then try again. Maya adjusted. Instead of leading him in long, smooth strides, as she had once done with her own, she shortened her steps and chose easier paths. She taught him what she knew best: how to keep close to the rock face when the wind rose, how to read the shadows for signs of movement, how to move without dislodging a single pebble. They practiced in the soft light of morning and evening while the canyon below yawned, still cool and blue. Sometimes, after a successful hunt, she brought him to the mouth of the den and let him look down. From their high perch, the basin spread out like a map: the thin green line of the spring, the darker smudge of cottonwoods, the pale patches where deer liked to graze. Coyotes trotted lazily along faint paths, tails swinging. Rabbits made quick, nervous dashes. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its call slicing the air. Huck's eyes drank it all in. It was the only world he knew, and he loved it with the simple, unquestioning joy of the very young. He did not yet know that somewhere, far below, other bobcats walked the ground with the ease of long practice, that they read scents and signs he didn't recognize. He only knew the feel of stone under his paws and the comfort of Maya's presence beside him. When he was big enough to follow her more than a few steps, she began taking him on short walks along the ledge. At first they stayed close to the den, circling only a little way before returning. Then, gradually, the circle widened. He learned where the rock underfoot turned crumbly, where small trickles of water made for slippery footing. He learned the smell of lightning-struck cedar and the sound of distant thunder echoing through the canyon long before the first drop of rain fell. In those early months, his voice was a small thing. He chirped and squeaked when he played, when he stumbled, when he was hungry. Sometimes he made a noise that was almost a miniature version of Maya's sharp, barking cough, a kitten's attempt at a cougar's announcement. She would answer with a softer sound, a reassuring puff of air through her nose, and he would let the imitation go, satisfied. Then came the evening when the sky turned a deep wash of indigo and the first stars pricked through, and Huck heard something new. They had found a favorite perch by then, a particular outcrop of rock that jutted slightly beyond the rest of the ridge, giving a clear view of the basin below. Maya would lie stretched along its length, her front paws crossed, her heavy head lifted just enough to see. Huck sat pressed against her side, his short tail flicking idly. The day's heat was bleeding away, and the stone under them felt pleasantly warm, like a sun-baked porch cooling at dusk in some small desert town many miles away, where people might just then be checking their home security systems and locking up for the night. Down in the basin, the first coyote trotted to the center of a dusty flat and stopped. Huck watched him with mild interest. He had seen coyotes before, heard their voices in the distance as a kind of chatter, but this one seemed to be taking his position with purpose. The animal planted his paws, tipped back his head, and opened his mouth wide. The sound that poured out was nothing like the bark of a dog or the cough of a cat. It was a long, smooth ribbon of sound, rising and falling in easy curves. It seemed to gather the dusk around it, pull the shadows closer. Huck felt the fur along his spine rise in response. He had not known a single voice could reach so far. Before that note finished, another coyote answered from the edge of the cottonwoods, then another from close to the spring. Within moments, the basin was alive with voices, weaving in and out of one another. High, low, short, long, each one distinct, yet all belonging to the same wild chorus. The sound flowed up the canyon wall, touched Huck's ears, and kept going, as if it would rise straight into the first few stars. Beside him, Maya's whiskers twitched once. She had heard coyote songs 1,000 times. To her it was simply another part of the desert's rhythm, no more or less remarkable than the rustle of rabbits in brush or the distant hum of a highway far beyond the canyon's lip. She did not feel the way Huck did, like something inside his chest had been plucked like a guitar string. He leaned forward, ears straining to catch every twist of the sound. The coyotes' bodies moved with it, shoulders rising, tails flicking, paws shifting. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the song ended. Silence dropped into the canyon like a soft blanket. Huck realized he was holding his breath. He let it out in a small rush and glanced up at Maya. She was watching the basin with her usual calm, as if she had not just heard the most extraordinary thing he could imagine. His mouth opened in a soundless question, but no words came. He didn't have words, only an urge, a sudden pressing desire to see if he could make the canyon talk back the way those coyotes had. The second chorus began a little later, after the first thin edge of night had settled in. This time, Huck knew it was coming. His heart began to thump faster as the lead coyote took his place. Voices rose, twined together, then faded. The moment between the last note and the return of quiet felt like a held breath, like the pause on a phone line before someone decides what to say. Maya shifted, preparing to stand and head back toward the den. Huck stayed where he was. He could feel the shape of his own body, the smallness of his chest, the stretch of his spine. He imagined himself down there, standing where Ridge stood, mouth open to the sky. The thought made his paws tingle. Before his courage could slip away, he drew in a breath. It filled him to the point of discomfort. He parted his jaws and pushed the air out, trying to shape it into the round, rolling sound he'd heard below. What came out started deep, a rumble that was pure cougar, a growl that lived in Maya's bones and had no business in the body of a bobcat. It startled even him. The rumble jumped up suddenly into a high, strangled yowl, more house cat than wild hunter, then broke apart entirely into a thin, tremulous line of sound that wobbled and cracked like an old radio signal cutting in and out. It was too much and not enough at the same time. The canyon caught that broken song and threw it back at him. There was no other noise to hide it, no traffic, no chatter of television or online banking commercials, no news anchor talking about credit card rates and life insurance policies. Just the clean mirror of stone, faithfully reflecting every wobble and mistake. Below, a few coyotes stopped in their tracks. One young one, not much older than Huck in spirit, barked in surprise. Another gave a low, uncertain growl. A third simply tilted her head, ears forward, as if trying to place the species of the singer. Heat flushed through Huck from nose to tail. His ears flattened. His throat felt raw, as if the sound had scraped its way out. He had wanted the canyon to throw his voice back to him like a gift. Instead, it felt like a spotlight, harsh and revealing. Maya had risen halfway to her feet when he sang. Now she settled back onto her haunches, her head turned toward him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable in the half-light. She did not scold him. Cougars did not howl like coyotes. Her own voice was made for short, sharp bursts of sound, for low, warning growls and sudden screams that froze prey in their tracks. The long, lonely line of a coyote's howl meant little to her. She saw only that the kit she had raised was suddenly small and tense and ashamed. She leaned down and bumped her head gently against his shoulder. He flinched, then eased under the familiar touch. She let out a soft chuff, a comforting sound, and began to walk toward the den, pausing long enough to glance back, inviting him to follow. Huck hesitated. Part of him wanted to stay, to try again and again until the sound finally matched what he heard in his own mind. Another part already carried the sting of failure, the knowledge that his attempt had fallen short. The coyotes had begun to move again, their bodies slipping into the brush as they headed toward their night's business. None of them sent an answer to his odd song. He turned away from the edge and padded after Maya. The stone under his paws felt cooler now. Inside the den, as he curled against her side and listened to the steady beat of her heart, the embarrassment softened, but it did not disappear. It settled into him, another small stone among many. He did not have words for it yet, but some quiet part of Huck understood that his voice did not fit neatly into any of the sounds he heard around him. It did not match the sharp calls of his mother, nor the flowing music of the coyotes. It was something in between, a misfit, a wrong note. He could not know that one day that same note would be the only one the canyon truly needed. For now he closed his eyes and let sleep come, carrying with it the memory of coyotes in the dust below, their sure voices rising toward a sky that always seemed to answer them back. By the time the next spring came round, Huck was no longer the small, damp scrap of fur Maya had dragged from the sand. His shoulders had filled out, his legs had lengthened, and there was a surety in the way he moved along the cliff that would have made any cougar proud. From a distance he still looked like a bobcat, all spots and compact muscle, but the stride he'd learned was pure mountain lion. Careful, deliberate, giving the sense that the ledge belonged to him and always had. The days were getting longer. Each afternoon the sun laid itself across the rocks a little later before slipping away, and the thin thread of water at the base of the canyon grew wider and greener. Huck watched the changes from their perch, restless in a way he couldn't name. The valley below had always been something to look at, like a picture hung on a wall. Now he began to feel something pulling him toward it, the way a young person feels tugged by the thought of leaving home, of walking through some bank door to sign their first lease, taking on a small mortgage, setting a course. Maya sensed his itch even if she couldn't quite understand its shape. She had lived most of her life on the high shelves, walking the lines between shadows and light. The basin, with its tangle of scents and voices and busy bodies, was a place she passed through, not a place she belonged. But she remembered what it felt like to have young muscles, to want to test every path. So one cool morning, as the first heat was just beginning to rise off the rocks, she did not stop Huck when he stepped ahead of her on the trail that led downward. He picked his way more carefully than usual, claws digging in for each step. The air felt different the lower they went, fuller, layered with smells that had only ever drifted up to him before. The damp, mineral tang of the spring, the sharpness of coyote, the musk of deer, the faint, bitter thread of human passed on a breeze from some far-off road where trucks carried people and their credit cards and worries about gas prices and health insurance premiums. Down here, the world was busier, more crowded, even if no one was visible. Yet. When they reached a shelf not far above the basin floor, Maya stopped. This was as far as she usually went unless she needed water. She touched her nose to Huck's shoulder, then turned aside toward a narrow path that would take her to a shaded pool upstream. If he kept going, he'd be stepping into the basin itself for the first time, onto ground where other cats walked as a matter of daily routine. Huck looked back at her. Her yellow eyes were calm, giving neither command nor warning. She had carried him as far as she could, in more ways than one. The rest would be his own doing. He took a breath and dropped the last few feet into the basin. The earth under his paws felt softer than the rock he was used to. It yielded a little with each step, holding his weight in a way stone never did. Grass brushed his legs. He could hear the tiny rush of the spring nearby, water slipping over the stones. Birds flitted from bush to bush, wings making soft, percussive sounds. For a moment he simply stood there, overwhelmed by how close everything felt. Movement at the edge of his vision caught his eye. Near the water, a rabbit froze, its body turned to a neat statue of fur and fear. Huck's muscles coiled without thinking. This, at least, he knew what to do with. He sank into a crouch the way Maya had taught him, shoulders low, belly close to the ground. But the cover here was different from the ledges above, brush and grass instead of boulders and shadow. His spotted coat blended well, yet he did not move quite like a bobcat should. Instead of the low, rippling stalk they used, He carried too much of his weight in his front, his hindquarters bunching as if ready for a long cougar leap. The rabbit saw the mistake before Huck did. It bolted, white tail flashing. Huck sprang, his claws slicing only empty air where the rabbit had been a moment before. He landed hard, skidding in loose dirt, a spray of dust rising around him. A sound of dry amusement drifted from the far side of the spring. "Nice try, Ridge Cat." Huck's ears swung toward the voice. Across the narrow ribbon of water, half in the shade of a mesquite, a large bobcat sat watching him. This cat was thick through the neck and shoulders, his fur marked with old scars that tugged the skin into pale lines. His eyes were the flat gold of someone who had seen enough seasons to stop being surprised by many things. Beside him, another bobcat lingered a little farther back. She was younger, her coat sleek, her markings clean and sharp. Her ears pricked forward with open curiosity, not yet dulled by years of caution. Both of them smelled deeply, unmistakably, like him. Earth, grass, rabbit, bobcat. Yet there was something else in the way they held themselves that made Huck suddenly aware of every borrowed habit in his own body. He straightened slowly, trying not to look as clumsy as he felt. The older cat's gaze ran over him from ears to tail, taking in the extra length of his stride, the way his weight sat a little too high. "You walk like a lion," the older bobcat said at last, his voice rough. "And you smell like one, too. What are you doing down here?" Huck opened his mouth, then closed it. He had never had to explain himself to anyone. Words, even the simple ones the cats used, warnings, invitations, challenges, felt clumsy. He settled for standing his ground, not backing away, but not advancing either. The younger bobcat stepped forward a pace, ignoring the older one's twitch of disapproval. She sniffed the air delicately, her nose wrinkling. "He is bobcat," she said quietly. "Underneath all that lion and cliff rock, there's bobcat." Her eyes softened. "Where's your mother?" Huck blinked. He pictured Maya, her long tail, her heavy paws. He pictured her silhouette against the sky on the ridge, the way she moved like part of the stone itself. He gave a small, uncertain gesture of his head toward the heights. "Up there," the older cat snorted. "Figures. We've seen her. Lone Cougar, running the ledges like she owns them. You mean to tell me she's raising you?" It was almost like listening to people at a coffee shop gossiping about the retiree who moved into the old house on the edge of town. The one with the solar panels and the paid-off mortgage, the one everyone has an opinion about. Huck felt the weight of their attention settle on him, thicker than any dust. He dipped his head once. Yes. The older cat's ears flattened briefly, then rose again. "Name's Thorn," he said. "This here's Lila." The younger bobcat gave a small nod, her gaze never leaving Huck's face. "We're from downriver. This basin's as much ours as anyone's. You walking in here like that? Others'll have questions." Huck didn't know what to do with that, so he stayed silent. Thorn flicked his tail, as if dismissing an argument that hadn't yet started. "Relax," Thorn muttered. "We're not about to take your hide, but you should know you don't move right. Not for our kind." His eyes narrowed, not unkindly, but with a sort of irritated concern. "Cougar taught you to walk and hunt, didn't she? You pounce like you've got twice the reach you really do. That'll get you hurt down here." Lila stepped closer, ignoring the sharp glance Thorn shot her. She was close enough now that Huck could see the fine, dark lines inside her ears, could smell the warm, familiar scent of cat that matched his own better than Maya's ever had. "How do you talk?" she asked softly. "Do you growl like a lion? Do you chirp like us? Do you howl like those coyotes?" There was no mockery in her tone, only genuine interest, as if she were asking about some new kind of bird call. Huck felt heat creep along his neck again at the mention of howling. He remembered the last echo of his wrong note bouncing off the canyon walls. He made a small sound in his throat, half chirp, half something else. And Lila's ears flicked in surprise. "That's strange," she breathed, but her eyes shone with a spark that wasn't fear. It was the look of someone who has just found a new story to tell around the edges of a fire. Before Huck could decide whether that made him feel better or worse, bushes on the far side of the spring stirred. A line of lean, dust-colored bodies slid into view. Coyotes, 6 of them, fanning out in an easy, confident arc. At their center walked Ridge, the same one Huck had watched so many evenings from the cliff. The coyotes slowed when they saw the 3 bobcats by the water. Ridge's ears pricked. His gaze moved from Thorn to Lila, then landed on Huck and stayed there. A faint smile, not friendly, not hostile, something in between, tugged at the corners of his muzzle. "Well now," Ridge said, his tone smooth, "if it isn't the Ridge singer himself. Looks different down here, doesn't he?" The young coyote beside him snickered softly. Thorn's shoulders stiffened. Lila's tail twitched. Huck felt himself caught in a triangle he hadn't meant to step into. Up on the ridge it had always been just him and the canyon and the voices tossing from below. Down here, in the valley, every look had weight, every word landed somewhere. Ridge took a few easy steps closer, careful not to cross an invisible line that would have turned the meeting into a fight. His eyes stayed on Huck. "We hear you sometimes," he went on. "Up there, trying to join in." His head tilted. "You don't sound like us. You don't sound like them." He flicked his nose toward Thorn and Lila. "You don't even sound like that big rock cat you run with. What are you trying to be?" The question was blunt, but there was something honest in it. It was not so different from the questions people ask themselves in quieter words when they sit up late at night at the kitchen table, running numbers on a retirement calculator, wondering if they are the kind of person who stays in one place or packs up and leaves. Who am I, really, when you strip away the job, the house, the insurance policies? Huck swallowed. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure such a thing existed in any language he knew. He glanced once toward the cliffs. From here, the ledges looked farther away than they ever had from above. The path back to Maya was still there, but it seemed narrower now, thinner, like a bridge made of mist. For the first time, standing by that spring with bobcats on one side and coyotes on the other, Huck understood that the strange, wrong-sounding voice inside him was not just about howls. It was about where he fit, and whether there was any place in this valley that would ever feel as if it had been made with someone like him in mind. For a long moment after Ridge's question, the air around the spring felt heavier than the water itself. Huck stood with one paw half lifted, caught between moving forward and backing away. The coyotes watched him with an open curiosity sharpened by pack instinct. Thorn watched him with the narrowed eyes of someone sizing up a problem he hadn't asked for. Lila watched him the way a person might watch a storm building on the horizon, half worried, half unable to look away. "What are you trying to be?" Ridge had said, as if there ought to be only one answer. Huck didn't have one. He only had the pull of the cliff behind him, the prickle of bobcat scent on his left, the hot wildness of coyote on his right. His throat worked, but no sound came. The wrong howl he'd thrown off the ridge a few nights before seemed to ring again in his ears. Thorn broke the silence first. "Doesn't matter what he's trying to be," the old bobcat rasped. "What matters is what he'll bring down on us if he keeps running around smelling like Cougar and singing like—" whatever that was. He flicked his ears toward Ridge. "We've lived alongside your kind long enough. We don't need a cliff cat teaching one of ours to forget who he is." Ridge's lips curved in a wry half-smile. "Forget? Looks to me like he never got to learn it in the first place." Lila's fur bristled, just a little. "He didn't ask for that storm," she said quietly. "He didn't ask to be left behind." Thorn gave a short, impatient grunt, like a man flipping off the evening news when the anchor starts talking about interest rates and credit card debt again. Nobody asks for what drops on their heads. You still have to decide what you're going to do about it. He stepped closer to the edge of the water, his gaze resting squarely on Huck now. "Listen to me, Ridge Cat. Cougar or not, you're Bobcat by blood. That means something. It means certain paths are yours and certain ones never will be. You can't run both the ridge and the basin without taking a fall sooner or later." Huck's claws flexed in the damp soil. "Maya raised me," he managed at last, the words rough from disuse. "She saved me." Thorn's expression softened for half a heartbeat, then hardened again. "Saved you, sure. Fed you, taught you not to walk off a cliff. Good. You owe her your life. But that doesn't make you Cougar any more than a human raised in a bank lobby becomes a stack of mortgage papers and life insurance policies. You're still flesh and blood, and your flesh and blood says Bobcat." Lila's tail twitched. "What Thorn means is, you can visit down here," she said, smoothing the edges of his words the way someone might soften bad news for an old friend. "But if you stay caught between places forever, neither side will trust you. Not us, not them." She nodded at Ridge. Ridge stepped in then, sensing an opening, his eyes gleaming with a different kind of calculation. "My pack doesn't care what your blood says," he said. "We care what your voice does. You want to run with us. You learn our ways. You learn to hunt with us, howl with us. You stop creeping around on high rocks like a mountain lion's shadow and start pulling your weight." He took another step closer, dust puffing around his paws. "But you don't get to keep a paw on the ridge and a paw in our songs. You come down, you commit. Or you stay up there with the big cat and keep talking to your own echo." There it was, the ultimatum, laid bare as a contract on a kitchen table. It was not so different from a human choosing between staying in the old family house, mortgage finally paid off, or selling it to move closer to grandkids in some other state. One life or another. One set of neighbors. One set of habits. You couldn't live full-time in both. Huck felt something in his chest twist. Thorn was right. He owed Maya everything. Without her, he would have been another small, forgotten heap of fur under the sand. But when he looked at Thorn and Lila, at the familiar patterns in their coats, felt the echo of their scent in his own, he felt a different tug, like a string pulled tight from inside his bones. Watching Ridge and the other coyotes, he felt yet another pull, the wild freedom of running in a group, of having voices to answer his in the dark. "Think on it," Thorn said, the harshness back in his voice. "You keep drifting around like this. You're going to bring trouble, one way or another." Ridge's tone was smoother, but no softer. "We'll be listening for your choice," he said. "Up there or down here, Cougar or pack. You try to be all three." He let the sentence fade, the implication hanging. The coyotes turned as one and trotted away, tails swinging, sliding into the scrub with the easy confidence of those who know exactly where they belong. Thorn and Lila lingered a moment longer. Lila gave Huck one last searching look, eyes full of questions he couldn't yet bear. "Be careful on those cliffs," she murmured. "They don't forgive many mistakes." Then they too were gone, melting into the low brush, leaving Huck alone by the water, with the taste of ultimatums on his tongue. He stood there until the light shifted and the shadows grew longer, until the spring's soft murmur was the loudest sound in his world. Then he turned and made his way back up, each step feeling heavier than the last. The path he had bounded down that morning, full of curiosity, now seemed steeper, the rocks sharper under his paws. Maya was waiting near the halfway point where the trail narrowed and turned. She had not gone far to the water after all, it seemed. Perhaps some instinct had kept her close, sensing that the basin had offered her adopted son more than rabbits and new smells that day. She sniffed him as he drew near, her whiskers flicking. He smelled of spring water, of bobcat, of coyote dust, of questions. Huck tried to walk past her with his usual easy stride, but something in the set of his shoulders must have betrayed him. She stepped sideways, blocking the path with her body. Her head lowered, eyes searching his face. She made a low sound deep in her chest, not quite a growl, not quite a question. "I'm fine," Huck wanted to say. Nothing happened. But the words stuck. How could he explain that something had happened, just not in a way that left marks on his fur? He brushed against her, slipping past as she allowed it, and climbed the rest of the way in silence. Behind them, the basin lay half in sun, half in shadow, full of lives that moved according to rules he was only beginning to understand. As evening fell and the coyotes began their song, Huck's restlessness grew from a quiet itch to a clawing impatience. Thorn's voice, Ridge's, Lila's, all spun together in his mind. Choose. Commit. You can't stay between worlds forever. The words scratched at him like sand under a collar. After the second chorus, he couldn't lie still any longer. While Maya dozed near the den entrance, her great head resting on her paws, he crept past her and out onto their favorite perch. The canyon spread below, dusky and familiar. The sky above held the first stars, blinking awake one by one. He walked right to the edge and looked down, as if the answer might be written in the pattern of juniper and stone, in the curve of the spring. His heart hammered. He remembered Thorn's warning about falls. He remembered Lila's gentle, "Be careful." Maybe, he thought wildly, if he could move like Maya, if he could leap like a cougar and land without stumbling, then none of it would matter. Then they would see he belonged up here, that the ridge was his, that the Lone Cougar's ways were enough. Without giving himself time to think, he backed up a few paces along the ledge, feeling the rock under each paw. Then he broke into a run, the way he had seen Maya do when she crossed wide gaps as easily as a human steps over a crack in the sidewalk. The wind rushed past his ears. The edge came up faster than he expected. He pushed off with all his strength. For a brief, soaring instant, he felt weightless, powerful, exactly what he had wanted to feel, like a true child of the cliffs, like someone who had never doubted the ground would be there when he landed. Then reality caught up. His smaller body didn't carry as far as Maya's. His front paws hit the far edge of the gap, but his back feet slipped, claws scraping stone. The world dropped out from under him. He scrabbled madly, hind legs kicking at empty air. Stone bit into his pads. Dust filled his nose. The canyon yawned below, a long, unforgiving fall that would leave nothing but a broken heap on the rocks. A thought flashed through his mind with startling clarity. This is how it ends, like a bad accident no one sees until it's already over, like someone driving without car insurance and realizing too late that they should have planned better. Then a heavy weight slammed into his side. Maya. She had come from nowhere, hurling herself across the gap with the smooth certainty of a cat born to that kind of distance. Her teeth closed on the loose skin at the back of his neck, the way she had once carried him as a tiny kit. Her paws hit solid rock. For a terrible second, her hind legs skidded, claws gouging long white lines in the stone. A slab near the edge crumbled away under the combined weight, tumbling down the cliff in a spray of gravel. But her front claws held. With a grunt that tore from deep in her chest, Maya hauled them both up and away from the edge, dragging Huck until they lay sprawled on the safer part of the ledge, lungs heaving. For a long time, all Huck could hear was the rush of his own blood in his ears and the distant, indifferent sound of the coyotes beginning another verse. He could feel Maya's breath against his side, harsh and hot, her body trembling with the effort of what she had just done. Slowly she released her grip on his neck. Her whiskers brushed his cheek as she leaned over him. Her eyes, when he dared to meet them, held no anger, only a fierce, aching fear. He looked past her, toward the broken edge where a fresh scar of pale rock showed where the ledge had given way. The path was still there, but narrower now, more fragile, as if the canyon itself had passed judgment on his attempt to prove he belonged. Huck swallowed hard. For the first time, he understood that the choice in front of him was not just about which voices he wanted to sing with. It was about survival, about whose ways would keep him alive and whose expectations might one day push him over a different kind of edge. Somewhere far below, Ridge's clean, confident howl rose into the dark. Huck lay very still beside the cougar who had just saved his life and wondered which was more dangerous, the risk of falling or the risk of living forever in the thin space between. The day the fire came started like any other hot, dry afternoon in the canyon. The sky was a hard, pale blue with no hint of mercy in it. Even the lizards moved slower, hugging the shadows, and the spring at the basin center had shrunk to a narrow ribbon of water, edged in cracked mud. Huck padded along the bank, his paws sinking slightly with each step, nose close to the ground as he followed the meandering trail of a jackrabbit that had passed through at dawn. Above him the cliffs glowed with heat. Maya had chosen to stay higher that day, stretched in a sliver of shade. She was slowing a little now, her muscles still strong, but not as quick to answer as they had been when she first pulled Huck from the sand. Time does that to every body, animal, and human alike. People notice it when the doctor starts talking about blood pressure and health insurance, when the letters about retirement savings arrive more often. For Maya, it showed in the way she paused a little longer before standing, in how she watched Huck with a worrying edge she never used to show. Huck flicked his ears, shaking off a fly, and raised his head. The basin, for the moment, was his thorn and taw. Lila were elsewhere, patrolling their own stretches of brush. Ridge's pack was likely holed up in some cool, hidden place, waiting for the sun to dip a bit closer to the horizon. The quiet felt odd, like the long-held breath before a song begins. He stretched, then crouched to lap at the spring. The water tasted warm and metallic, but it soothed his throat. A few yards away, a pair of young coyote pups tumbled over one another, their mother watching with half an eye as she dozed. Beyond them, near a patch of low scrub, Lila's latest litter of bobcat kits practiced their stalking, pouncing on grasshoppers and each other in turn. The basin held more youngsters than usual this season, as if the land itself were trying to make up for past losses all at once. Overhead the light shifted, just slightly. A thin veil of cloud, too high to give any real shade, drifted across the sun. Huck glanced up, more from habit than concern. That was when he saw the first dark finger of smoke on the northern horizon. At first it was small, just a gray smudge against the blue, the kind of thing a human might mistake for a distant brush pile or a neighbor burning trash, something their home insurance policy might mention in the fine print under fire risk without anyone really taking it to heart. But the canyon had its own way of warning those who lived in it. The air changed, picking up a faint, acrid tang. The wind, which had been moving lazily from the west, swung around in a sudden, uneasy shift. Huck stared at the smoke. It thickened as he watched, curling and twisting into the sky. A low growl of thunder rolled across the flats beyond the canyon's mouth, followed by a faint, distant flash. Not the heavy kind of lightning that comes with rain, but the dry, crackling strike of a storm with no water in it. He felt his fur rise along his spine. The first hint of panic came not from him, but from the smaller animals. Birds burst from the brush in tight, agitated flocks, their calls sharp and broken. The rabbit trails that had seemed so interesting a moment before went still as their makers dove for cover. The coyote pups paused their play, noses lifting, ears swiveling toward the strange smell on the wind. Far above, on the ridge, Maya stood. Huck could just make out her silhouette against the sky, tail rigid, head turned toward the creeping column of smoke. She smelled it too. Then, carried on the shifting air, came the flat, terrifying crack of a lightning strike landing close, not up on the bare rock, but somewhere in the scrub at the canyon's rim. A heartbeat later, he saw it, a thin, bright tongue of flame licking up from the edge of a patch of dry grass. Fire in the desert is a strange thing. People sometimes think there's nothing to burn, as if bare rock and sand are immune. But a few years of good rain, a little more grass than usual, and suddenly there is fuel enough. One spark, one stray cigarette, one dry storm with no rain to cool the ground. And it's like someone has dropped a match in the middle of a pile of unpaid bills. Everything catches at once, running faster than you'd think. The flame climbed a small bush, then leapt to another. The wind, now blowing straight into the canyon, caught it like breath in a flute. In moments, the bright line became a jagged ribbon, racing along the rim, looking for more to eat. Huck's stomach tightened. From where he stood in the basin, he could see exactly how the canyon was shaped. Steep walls funneling down toward the spring, narrow side gullies leading nowhere. It was a trap waiting to be sprung if the fire came down instead of staying above. A shout-like bark snapped his attention back to the ground. Ridge, lips drawn tight, had appeared at one of the narrow entrances to the basin. His pack spilled in behind him, all business now, bodies low, ears pinned. The easy swagger Huck had seen so many evenings was gone, burned away by urgency. "Get them moving." Ridge's voice cut across the water, sharp as a whip. "Up the side paths, not the main gullies. Fire's coming fast." Lila bounded into view from another direction, Thorn right behind her, both of them bristling, their eyes wide in a way Huck had never seen. The bobcat kits scattered toward her, mewling in confusion. The coyote pups streaked back to their mother, tails tucked, yipping. Heat touched the back of Huck's neck, faint but growing. He looked up again. The stalk had thickened into a dirty wall, and behind it he could see the flicker of flames beginning to snake down the canyon's edges, finding every dry branch, every patch of old grass. The wind carried sparks like glowing seas. "Move!" Thorn snarled, hustling his kits ahead of him toward a sloping path that climbed one of the side walls. "Don't argue. Just go." Animals began to run, but not in the easy, playful way of moments before. Their movements were jerky, frantic. The open basin that had felt like a safe, shared bowl now seemed cruelly exposed, an empty plate waiting to be licked clean by fire. Huck's paws felt rooted to the spot. His eyes darted between the creeping line of flame, the panicking youngsters, the narrow paths that led upward. He could see where they needed to go, could trace the safest routes in his mind, the way a good financial advisor can see the least risky way through a tangle of retirement accounts and life insurance policies. But seeing and being heard were two different things. Ridge's pack fanned out, snapping and barking, trying to drive the smallest animals toward the right paths. Their voices were loud, but the sound of the fire, now cracking and roaring as it found thicker brush, swallowed some of their calls. In the confusion, one of Lila's kits froze halfway between the spring and the slope, body flattened, eyes huge. A coyote pup darted in the wrong direction entirely, heading toward a narrow gully that would soon act like a chimney. Huck's heart slammed against his ribs. He knew those side paths intimately. He had walked them 100 times from above, learned every bend and loose stone. If he could get everyone to look where he needed them to, if he could pin their attention long enough, he could point them to safety. He tried to shout, but his voice came out as a raw, useless yowl, lost under the crackle and the rising thunder of collapsing brush. Panic clawed at him. The fire line had begun to crawl down in earnest now, little tongues flicking out to taste the canyon floor. On the ridge, Maya gave a cough that was almost a roar, but even her great voice sounded small in the chaos. Something inside Huck snapped into place then, not with calm exactly, but with a kind of fierce necessity. The wrongness of his howl, the way it didn't quite fit with any other sound in the canyon, rose in his memory like a dare. No one listens, he thought wildly, unless it's something they've never heard before. He scrambled up onto a low boulder that jutted from the basin floor, lifting him above the running bodies. The stone burned his pads faintly. Heat was beginning to radiate down now. He planted all 4 paws, drew in as much air as his lungs could hold, and let everything inside him spill out at once. The sound that burst from his chest was not coyote, not cougar, not bobcat. It began as a deep, rattling growl, the kind Maya used when warning off a rival, then climbed without warning into a high, tearing yowl that belonged to no one but him. From there, it stretched into a long, trembling note that tried to be a howl, breaking and mending, like a siren that had been bent out of shape. It was ugly. It was loud. It was utterly, unmistakably wrong. The canyon grabbed it and hurled it back a dozen different ways. The sound bounced off the walls, echoing from 3 directions at once. It cut through the crackle of burning brush, through the shouts and barks and screams. It stopped animals in their tracks, not with fear of a predator, but with pure bewilderment. Every head turned. In that heartbeat of stunned stillness, Huck took another breath and did it again, and again. Each warped, painful note seemed to chew through the air, clawing its way into every crevice of the canyon. It hurt his throat. It made his ears ring, but he saw what it did. Lila's frozen kit jerked its head up, eyes locking on him. Ridge's wayward pup skidded to a stop, spinning to follow the source of the noise. Even Thorn, halfway up the slope, paused and looked back, his gaze snapping from Huck to the safest path upward. "This way," Huck croaked, though the words were secondary to the racket he was making. He swung his head toward the nearest side trail and flung another warped howl in that direction, as if his voice itself were pointing. Ridge understood first. Smart leaders always do. He picked up the cue, racing toward the base of the indicated path, his own sharp, familiar bark now layered, on top of Huck's unholy caterwaul. Lila herded her kits that way, adding her urgent chirps. One by one, the others caught on, moving instinctively toward the place the strange sound seemed to be dragging their attention. Fire licked closer, heat tugging at fur, singeing whiskers. Sparks began to fall like angry, glowing insects. Huck's lungs burned. He kept going, howl after howl, his voice fraying at the edges. The uglier it got, the more the canyon seemed to carry it, like a siren cutting through traffic. Up on the ridge, Maya watched her adopted son stand on that stone and tear his voice to pieces for the sake of animals who had never quite known what to make of him. She saw the fire line curve and hesitate as the living shapes it had been chasing scrambled up the safer paths, away from its teeth. She saw Ridge glance up once, just long enough for gratitude and something like respect to flicker in his eyes before he turned back to his work. For the first time since the sandstorm that had nearly stolen him, Huck's wrong howl was exactly what the canyon needed. The fire would keep coming. There would be more dangers, more choices, more nights when voices rose to meet a sky that did not answer. But on this night of flame and smoke, the sound that never fit anywhere finally found its purpose, ringing off the walls like a stubborn, desperate promise that not one more life would be lost if he could help it. By the time the last of the pups and kits scrambled onto the higher ledges, the basin below had become a shallow bowl of smoke. The fire moved like a living thing, licking along the edges, testing every dried stalk and brittle branch. Huck's throat felt flayed from the inside, his chest burning from more than the heat. Each breath was a scrape of sandpaper. But when he looked up and saw the narrow paths crowded with panting, frightened bodies that were still alive, the pain seemed like a fair price. Ridge stood on a shelf just above the main trail, flanks heaving, tongue lolling. His pack clustered around him in a ragged half-circle. Lila crouched a little farther along the ledge, her kits pressed in tight against her belly, their eyes huge and round. Thorn stood guard at the rear of the group, his body a solid wall between the youngsters and the worst of the smoke. For a moment all those eyes turned toward Huck. He was still on his boulder in the basin floor, a small, soot-streaked shape against the rising glow. The fire line had curled around behind him now, closing like a fist. Sparks fell around his paws, stinging like hot insects. Every instinct screamed at him to run for the nearest path, to claw his way up to the safety of the ledge where the others waited. "Huck!" Lila's voice cracked across the air, thin but fierce. One of her kits echoed it in a frightened squeak. Ridge barked once, sharply. "Get up here! That rock's going to be toast in a minute!" Huck's ears caught their urgency, but another sound slipped in. Beneath it, a harsh, ragged cough, barely audible over the fire's roar. It came from the left, from lower down the canyon wall, where a narrow pocket of shadow still clung to the stone. Maya. He turned his head, squinting through the smoke. At first he saw nothing but shifting gray and orange, then a flicker of tawny fur moved in the haze, followed by another strangled cough. She had been above him when the fire started. Somewhere in the scramble of heat and smoke and stampeding animals, she must have tried to come down. Maya. The word tore out of him, hoarse and useless. She could not answer with words, but another cough came, and this time he heard the thin edge of panic in it. If he ran for the ledge now, he could reach safety. He could scramble up one of the side paths he'd pointed everyone else toward, collapse at Ridge's feet, let Lila fuss over his raw throat while Thorn made some gruff remark about lucky breaks. He could lie there and watch the fire do what fire does, or he could go the other way. Later, older humans would sit at kitchen tables with coffee mugs and retirement calculators trying to make decisions about what they could afford to risk. They would talk about life insurance and home insurance and what might happen if a wildfire ever reached the edge of their neat, fenced yards. They would wonder where the line was, when to stay, when to go, when to gamble, and when to hold back. Huck did not have calculators or policies, only the memory of a sandstorm and a pair of strong jaws pulling him from it. His paws moved before his thoughts caught up. Instead of bolting for the closest path up, he sprang from the boulder toward the thin ledge that jutted from the canyon wall below Maya's last cough. Heat shoved at his side like a solid hand. The air seared his nose. Smoke clawed at his eyes, drawing tears that blurred the world into streaks of gray and gold. Up on the safer ledges, Ridge swore under his breath. "That fool cat," he rasped. Thorn's ears flattened. "He's going after her." Lila said nothing. Her claws flexed in and out of the rock, helpless, as she watched Huck's small shape vanish into the thickest part of the smoke. Down in the heat, Huck, kept his body low, moving by feel as much as sight. He drew on everything Maya had ever taught him about cliff and stone. The wall here was not the clean, easy face of the upper ridge. It was broken and jagged, with old scars where past rockfalls had bitten chunks away. He tested each paw hold before shifting his weight, feeling for the subtle give that warned of loose rock. The heat was worse near the canyon wall, where the fire had already found a few scraggly bushes and was working its way up. Flames licked at the rock, hungry tongues searching for more fuel. The sound of it was a constant rushing hiss, like 1,000 radios tuned between stations all at once. He coughed, the smoke tearing at his lungs. The world narrowed to the stone. Inches from his nose, the next place to put his paw, the next breath. Somewhere in that roaring chaos he heard Maya again, closer now. He rounded a jut of rock and nearly collided with her. She lay half-collapsed in a shallow pocket in the wall, one hind leg twisted under a fallen slab. Her fur was singed along one side, blackened in patches. Her sides heaved as she dragged in air that seemed to do her as much harm as good. Her eyes, though, were clear and sharp as they fixed on him. For an instant, Huck saw himself as the canyon might have years ago, a tiny, sand-choked bundle in a storm, helpless under the weight of something bigger than he could understand. Maya had not turned away then. He would not turn away now. He moved without calling her name again. There was no breath to spare. Lowering himself beside the fallen rock, he pressed his shoulder against it and pushed. It shifted a fraction of an inch, scraping against the stone beneath. Pain shot down his side. His muscles burned in protest. Maya tried to help, bracing her front paws, claws digging in. Together they heaved. The slab grudgingly gave a little more, then caught again, wedged around her trapped leg. The fire crackled closer, eating its way along a snag of dried roots above them. A branch popped, showering them with sparks. "Huck!" Lila's voice floated faint and ragged from somewhere above, torn apart by the wind. He ignored it. He shifted his stance, remembering the way Maya had once taught him to use leverage on a stubborn bone, rocking it instead of yanking. He dug his claws into a small crack, set his shoulder under the edge of the rock, and leaned, not just pushing, but rolling, letting the stone's own weight work against itself. The slab shuddered, then tipped just enough for Maya to jerk her leg free. She cried out, more in surprise than pain, as she tumbled sideways, her body scraping along Huck's. The rock dropped into the pocket her leg had occupied, sending up a small cloud of dust. "Come on," Huck gasped, nudging at her neck. "We have to go." Her injured leg dragged, but cougars are not easily broken. She got her paws under her and leaned heavily against the wall, limping forward as Huck guided her along the narrow ledge. It was barely wide enough for them to move side by side. At one point, the rock crumbled under Maya's weight, and Huck had to throw himself against her chest to keep her from sliding over the edge. Above, on a safer stretch of wall, Ridge and his pack had reached a place where they could look down without choking on the worst of the smoke. Thorn stood a little apart, his body still shielding Lila's kits, but his eyes were locked on the small, moving shapes below. They watched as the bobcat and the cougar inched their way along the narrow shelf, the fire clawing at them from one side, empty air waiting on the other. They watched Huck pause at a broken section of ledge, judge the distance, then leap lightly to the next. Foothold, turning at once to coax Maya across with a soft bump of his head. "That's not Cougar," Ridge murmured, almost to himself. "That's not Bobcat either." "That's Huck," Lila said quietly. Smoke had reddened the whites of her eyes, but there was a fierce pride in them now. "That's who he is." It took only minutes for Huck and Maya to reach the base of the side path that led up to the others, but it felt like an hour. By the time they climbed onto the ledge, Huck's legs shook with exhaustion. His fur was streaked with soot, and patches of it had curled where sparks had kissed him. Maya limped heavily, each breath a controlled, careful thing. As they came over the edge, the animals already there parted without thinking, making room for them. Even Thorn stepped aside, his eyes never leaving Huck's face. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. The fire's roar filled the canyon below, but up here, in that small pocket of safety, there was only the sound of labored breathing and the soft crumble of pebbles under shifting paws. Then Ridge moved. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Huck until they stood nose to nose. A few weeks earlier, such closeness might have meant a fight. Now Ridge only looked, his gaze tracing every scorch mark, every tremor. "That howl of yours," he said roughly, "got my pups out alive." His head tilted toward the canyon wall behind them. "And whatever that mess was down there, it got her out too." Huck swallowed, unsure what answer, if any, was expected. Ridge's lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a snarl. "You don't sound like us," he went on. "You don't move like them." His tail flicked toward Thorn and Lila. But if you stand on a rock when fire's coming and scream yourself hoarse for other people's kids, my pack's not going to call you wrong anymore." He stepped back and let out a short, sharp bark, one Huck had never heard before. The other coyotes answered with a low murmur, not the wild chorus of a hunt, but something more solemn. It rolled along the ledge like a small wave and died away. Thorn padded up next, his expression hard to read through the soot and the lines age had carved into his face. For once, there was no irritation in his voice. "You still walk funny," he said, a ghost of his old gruffness lurking in the words. "Still smell like cougar and rock and too much sky." His gaze slid to Maya, resting briefly on her injured leg, then back to Huck. "But you went down when everyone else was scrambling up. That counts for something." He inclined his head, just a fraction. For a bobcat like Thorn, it was as good as a bow. Lila stepped past him, her kits peeking out from behind her legs. She touched her nose gently to Huck's cheek. "When this is over," she said, "you won't have to stand at the spring wondering if you're welcome. You bring that crooked voice of yours down there any time you like." Huck's throat tightened. He blinked, and smoke wasn't the only thing stinging his eyes. Behind them, Maya eased herself down onto the rock, her injured leg stretched out. She watched the exchange with a tired, deep satisfaction. "This," she seemed to say with her calm, steady gaze, "is what comes from choosing to save and be saved." Over and over again, the fire would move on. The canyon would heal in its own slow way. Grass would grow over the black scars, and life would press forward because that is what it does. Humans driving along distant highways would glance out at the darkened patches of hillside and think about wildfire coverage and home insurance and whether their own houses were safe. They would not know about a bobcat and a lone cougar and a pack of coyotes who shared a narrow ledge and a changed silence one smoky evening. Up there on the rock, among ash and fear and the damp smell of singed fur, something had shifted. Huck was no longer just the odd one on the ridge, the wrong voice in the night. He was the bridge between three worlds that had never quite trusted each other. He was the proof that sometimes the note that sounds out of place is the one that holds the whole song together. By late summer, the fire was no longer a bright, hungry thing. It had become memory and aftermath, a black ring around the basin, and long, dark fingers reaching up the canyon walls. Rain had come in soft, stingy showers, not enough to erase the scars, but enough to coax a fuzz of green from the ash. The canyon was rebuilding itself one blade of grass at a time, the way people rebuild their lives after a house fire or a layoff, checking their home insurance, tightening a budget, starting over with whatever they have left. Huck moved through this changed world like someone walking through a familiar room after the furniture's been rearranged. He knew every curve of the rock, every bend of the spring, but the colors were new, the smell sharper. Charcoal and fresh shoots and the faint, ghostly scent of smoke that still clung to some places when the wind blew just right. Maya healed slowly. The burned fur grew back in uneven patches, and the leg that had been trapped under the rock never quite carried her weight the same way again. She tired sooner now, resting more in the shade. Her body had become like an old house with a good foundation and a few creaks in the floorboards, still standing, still shelter, but making its age known. Huck hunted for both of them. He ran the ledges at dawn and dusk, slipping down into the basin when the light was gentle, bringing back rabbits, quail, the occasional unlucky squirrel. Sometimes, when there was more than he and Maya needed, he would leave a half-eaten carcass on a flat stone near the spring. By morning, it would be gone, taken by Thorn's family or Ridge's pack. No one talked about it. The food just flowed where it was needed, like water finding a path downhill. The edges between territories had blurred a little since the fire. Coyotes still kept to their own trails, bobcats to theirs, and Maya remained a creature of the higher cliffs. But there were more pauses now when paths crossed. More slow blinks instead of narrowed eyes, more nods than growls. Lila's kits chased coyote pups in clumsy, sputtering games that ended with everyone rolling in the dust, pretending the rules of species didn't matter for a few minutes. Huck moved among them like a thread tying patches of an old quilt together. One day he might walk the basin with Lila, showing her a new place where the grass was coming in thick. Another evening he would sit beside Ridge on a rock shelf, watching the sky, listening to the pack leader talk in low, easy tones about where the deer were bedding now, where the burned brush would grow back best. At night he still curled up beside Maya in the den, feeling her breath move slow and steady against his back. And yet, for all the new acceptance, one thing inside him hadn't changed. His voice was still wrong. Some evenings he avoided using it at all, letting the coyote's chorus rise and fall without adding his own crooked note. Other nights, when the loneliness got under his skin in a way company couldn't fully touch, he slipped out onto the old perch above the basin and tried again. The sound that came out of him was still the same cracked mixture of growl and yowl and howl, the same strange, bent siren that had startled everyone on the night of the fire. The difference was what came after. Now, when his note echoed off the canyon walls, the coyotes didn't fall silent in confusion. Ridge would lace a sharp, clean call into the space after it, not covering Huck's sound, but answering it. The rest of the pack followed, weaving their voices around that jagged line like threads around a knot. From the basin, Lila's high, rough chirp lifted once or twice, her kits adding a few squeaky attempts of their own. Even Thorn, when he was in a particularly good mood, might let out a short, grumbling cough that wasn't quite a song and wasn't quite nothing. Still, when the echoes faded and the stars looked down with their usual indifferent light, Huck sometimes lay awake with the old question circling in his mind. Why had his throat shaped itself this way? Why couldn't he just sound like everyone else? Like the coyotes below, like the bobcats by the water, like the cougar who had given him life twice over. Humans ask similar things in their own way, staring at ceilings in the dark, worrying about whether they saved enough for retirement, whether their health insurance will hold if something goes wrong, whether they chose the right road decades ago. One evening, when the heat of the day had bled away and the canyon held that brief, cool hush before night fully settled, Huck climbed alone to the highest point of the ridge. Maya watched him go, her eyes thoughtful, but she did not call him back. She understood that some walks had to be taken by yourself, even when you're not truly alone in the world anymore. He reached the narrow tip of the outcrop where, long ago, he had first tried to mimic the coyote's song and gotten only echo and embarrassment for his trouble. The rock still remembered his claws. Faint scratches marked the place where he had once nearly gone over the edge. Beyond it, the basin lay quiet and dark, dotted with the pale shapes of sleeping brush and stone. Huck sat down, letting his tail hang loose over the ledge. For a moment he simply breathed, drawing in the smells of the cooled rock, the faint wetness from the spring, the distant dusty tang of a highway far beyond the canyon's lip where people in pickup trucks and RVs rolled past without knowing what they were passing. Then, slowly, he tipped back his head. He didn't think about Ridge's smooth howl or Maya's sharp warning scream or the chirps and growls and hisses that filled the canyon on any ordinary day. He didn't try to force his voice to match something it wasn't. He just opened his mouth and let one long breath become sound. It started as it always did, deep in his chest, a rumble that didn't quite fit his size. It climbed, warbling and uneven, into a yowl too wild to be a cat's and too rough to be a coyote's. It stretched out past comfort, shaking at the top, threatening to break, and then stubbornly refusing to let go. It was the same wrong howl he had always had, but this time, as it rolled out over the canyon and crashed back against him, He felt something new threaded through the old embarrassment: pride. Before the last shiver of his note faded, another voice answered. Ridge's call rose from a ledge halfway down the wall, a clean, strong line that curved around Huck's broken one like an arm. Then came the chorus of the pack, filling in the spaces, building a harmony that made room for the crooked note in its center, instead of drowning it out. From near the spring, Huck heard Lila's rough, familiar chirp. It was followed by a higher, wobblier sound that made him jolt in surprise. One of her kits, braver than the others, always wandering a little farther from her side, had climbed onto a low rock and was trying to copy him. The little bobcat's voice squeaked and cracked, careening wildly between registers, landing nowhere in particular. It sounded, Huck thought with a sudden rush of warmth, absolutely terrible. He listened to that small, awful, earnest howl and felt his whiskers twitch in something very close to laughter. The kit tried again and again, as if determined to get it wrong in exactly the same way Huck did. On another ledge, Thorne shook his head, but there was no contempt in the gesture. On the contrary, his mouth curved in what, on any other face, might have been called a smile. "Looks like your bad habits are catching," he muttered. Beside him, one of Ridge's younger coyotes let out an experimental call that wobbled just enough to brush Huck's odd tone before sliding back into a more traditional shape. It was as if the whole canyon were tentatively trying on this new, crooked sound, seeing how it felt in their mouths. Huck drew in another breath and sent his own howl up once more, meeting theirs halfway. Wrong, right? It didn't matter so much now. For the first time, he wasn't throwing his voice into an empty space and waiting for the canyon to decide whether to keep it or give it back. He was part of something, messy, mismatched, but undeniably shared. If someone had been camping on the flats that night, sitting in a folding chair beside a rented RV, checking credit card balances on a phone, and thinking about mortgage rates back home, they might have paused when they heard that strange choir. They would have picked up the coyote voices easily, a familiar soundtrack to desert evenings. But under and around it, they might have heard something they couldn't quite name, a bent, insistent note that didn't belong anywhere, and yet somehow held everything together. Up on the ridge, Maya eased herself out of the den and lay where she could see Huck's silhouette against the star-thick sky. She listened to her adopted son sing in the only way he ever could, and to the way the canyon now sang back to him. Her eyes closed, the lines of worry in her face smoothing into something like peace. Huck did not suddenly understand his voice that night. He didn't wake up the next morning with a neat answer to why his howl felt wrong, why it had never matched any pattern laid out for him. But he did understand this. His life, like his song, had never been meant to fit only one set of rules. Raised by a lone cougar, born of bobcat blood, watched and weighed by a coyote pack, he was all of those things, and none of them. And that was all right. Some voices are made to blend in. Others are made to be noticed. His, it seemed, had been made to cut through smoke and fear, to pull eyes toward the safest path, to remind three wary worlds that they could learn a new tune if they were willing. On the ridge that night, under a sky big enough to hold every kind of sound, Huck's wrong howl rose and fell, surrounded by answering calls that didn't match and didn't need to. And for the first time in his life, as the echoes faded and the canyon settled into sleep, he lay down beside Maya, with the quiet, steady knowledge that his voice, exactly as it was, belonged. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.